Now, as you say, grandfather Owen Barfield is known as the first and last Inkling. The first because he was the first to publish and he brought the Inkling impulse, and the last because he outlived the others and he was publishing long after the others had actually even passed away. But he's also the Inkling's Inkling, so that's a sort of bit of an insider thing. Anybody that knows about the Inklings will know about a grandfather's work and how he influenced the Inklings. But you have to sort of go a little bit into the Inklings to sort of start understanding what his role was, because he was the philosopher in the group. So then if you're going to take the Inkling studies seriously or to a deeper level, you've got to start to understand some of the philosophy behind it. And that's what's so important. And that's really what grandfather cared about. He didn't care about biographies and personalities. He didn't promote himself at all. He wanted people to know what he was trying to communicate and to take an interest in his actual work. So what is his work? His work was about the evolution of consciousness. Now, that's a big theme, the evolution of consciousness. But that is grandfather's theme. That's what his work was. And he was consistently working on that throughout his life. And his angle, the way he looked at that, was through evidence in language. So he studied language and he could see or detailed the evolution of consciousness, of human consciousness, as we've experienced that through language. And of course, Tolkien himself described himself as a philologist. That's how he saw himself, an interest in language, a professor of language. So immediately, Tolkien and grandfather had a lot in common. And in fact, it was grandfather's earliest books, History in English Words, Poetic Diction, both of which deal with this theme of language, and also his fairy tale, The Silver Trumpet, which really formed Tolkien's worldview. The fairy tale was a sort of proof of concept. He read it to his kids, and he could understand that through fairy tales, he can communicate really quite complicated ideas in a kind of an accessible way. That proof of concept was given to him by grandfather with The Silver Trumpet. But also books like Poetic Diction, Tolkien found himself having to correct his worldview. He was in a lecture, he was saying one thing, he had to stop and say, no, I can't say that anymore. I've taken on board grandfather's thought, this it's got to be this. So those two early books, History in English Words and Poetic Diction, were sort of hallmark books, landmark books for Inkling studies and the Inklings themselves. Now, Tolkien was introduced to grandfather by C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis was grandfather's sort of good friend. They described each other as their second friend because they each had a first friend. And I'll come to that in a moment. But the second friend, they met in their first term at university. And from then on, they were a lifelong friends. And what grandfather is sort of best known for, or is his role in the story of C.S. Lewis, is famously C.S. Lewis was an atheist. He was an atheist writer, an atheist thinker. And grandfather brought him over from atheism to theism. The next step to Christianity was a further step, but that big step, moving from atheism to theism, was done through grandfather's influence, if you like, his philosophy. And they're also known for something that's called the Great War. They called it the Great War themselves. And the Great War is really a philosophical dispute that they had. And it was ongoing for about the best part of 10 years, sort of throughout the 90s. There's a lot to it, but to really give a summary of it, it's about the role of imagination, how important imagination is to our way of knowing and understanding. And also, what is our relationship with the divine? So, on those two questions, they differed. They didn't come to an agreement. They remained at different positions. But Lewis kind of backed down from the argument. He didn't want to continue it. So that's how the Great War came to an end. Because just one night, after a very heavy debate, Lewis said, "I just can't take this anymore," and refused to discuss any more on it. But on imagination, grandfather felt that imagination was a valid route to knowledge, that you could, through reason combined with imagination and feeling, you can actually gain spiritual insights. So it's a way towards theology through the imagination. And Lewis said, no, imagination is just imagination. There's nothing more to it. But Grandfather was saying, no, it's actually a route for something bigger. And the other thing is the relationship of the divine. So Grandfather's position on the divine and our relationship with the divine is that the divine is eminent. And Lewis said, no, it's transcendent. So Lewis had a sort of transcendent view of the divine, and Grandfather had an eminent view of the divine. Now, people like to make a lot of that debate, but in fact, they were friends. You know, this is the whole thing about a debate. These are debates within friends. And so the fact that they were both really cared deeply about the imagination and the divine put them on the same page. So people like to say they were different, but they weren't. This is why they were all Inklings together. This is what they had in common. This is what they cared about. But they didn't just care about it. They cared very, very deeply about it, so much so that they thought correctly, in my view, that the future of humanity depends on understanding this work. You know, if humanity is going to progress, if it's going to evolve, it needs to understand these matters, and it needs to mature in its relationship to these matters, imagination and the divine. Anyway, how did they meet? How did these debates take place? Well, mostly walking and talking. So they'd meet about 6 times a year for a weekend walk. That was the main process. And that lasted from their university days all the way up to World War II. So it's almost a 20-year span there of walking and talking. There was 4 key people in those walks. So it was Cecil Harwood, who's Grandfather's first friend, and we'll mention Cecil Harwood again. There was Lewis, there was Grandfather, and there was another person called Walter Fields. Walter Fields was the guy who sort of did the logistics. He drove the car. If they needed to be collected, he booked the hotel, because these things somebody needs to arrange. Right? So Walter Hoover did the logistics. Cecil Harwood was great. He was a very upbeat, very good human person. He kept things moving along. And then Grandfather and Lewis were the kind of debaters, and a lot of the debate was around what they were discussing. And they'd have a particularly long walk at Easter time. So the Easter walk might be 4 days, or 5 days, 4 nights, that kind of walk. And on at least 2 occasions, Tolkien was invited to one of these long walks. I mean, they walked from coast to coast. It was a long, long walk. You know, you can discuss a lot of things at this level if you're walking and talking for 4 days in a row. So this is Tolkien's interaction is mainly through that. But Grandfather did occasionally attend Inkling meetings in Oxford. And of course, during World War II, he moved his family to Oxford. So he had a presence in Oxford during World War II, which is when Charles Williams moved to Oxford as well. So he met Charles Williams in these Inkling meetings as well. So they kind of all knew each other, and there was a kind of general group of friendship. And this is when the kind of heavy thinking and heavy lifting on the philosophy was done. But Grandfather's first Inkling moment, the first sort of hint he got that there was something going on here, or something to think about, was when he was 15 years old at school, Highgate School. That's also the school that I went to. And he was sat in his Latin class, and his best friend was sat next to him, Cecil Harwood. Cecil Harwood was reading out loud a Latin text, and literally the Latin text, it meant death, but it read out, walked out of life. And that metaphor really meant something. That poetic metaphor kind of resonated in Grandfather in a way that it was his first Inkling moment. And from then on, he started to study language and study what these metaphors meant. The next moment for him, if you like, is he was called up for war service in World War I. He joined the engineering corps as a signaller. He was an officer. But very curiously, although war was going on, he was never sent to the front. There was also almost a kind of a mysterious hand holding him back. And then when the armistice was declared, he was immediately sent to Belgium. But that was a great time to arrive in Belgium because there's no fighting going on. Everybody else was just busy sort of trying to get home and demobbing. He had nothing to do there. So he learned French, he studied, all the books you could possibly want to study. He went horse riding and motorbike riding through the countryside. And crucially, he met soldiers from around the world. So there were troops from Canada, America, Australia, all the colonies, they were all there. So he had a very kind of open experience, or a world university type experience, very early on. The lovely thing about that is, because it was a war effort, to serve the soldiers at the front line, they had a military operation to get any book that any soldier wanted to them. And this is the military running the library service, the National Library Service. So nobody else was reading because they were all trying to get home. Nobody else was doing anything. So grandfather was putting in every single book he wanted and receiving everything that the whole country could provide him, because he was on war service. So that was his university experience before he even got to university. Then, of course, he got to university. And in his first year at university, he was recruited or encouraged to join a folk touring group. And he went dancing in Cornwall, which was the far southwest of England, with a lady who organized this. And that lady turned out would later become his wife, so my grandmother. And she organized this tour. And it was a tour of folk music and dance. And they did it 2 summers in a row. It was they dressed up and they had a sort of variety of folk dances to dance, and they toured around the countryside in local villages. Now, grandfather definitely did not like talking about himself, his own biography, and whenever I'd ask him to sort of mention the Inklings or his friends, he wouldn't really say very much. When I asked him to talk about himself, he wouldn't say very much, but he would sort of start his story with this folk music and dance tour. And when I shared this experience with his biographer, a man called Simon Blaxland-Delange, who wrote a biography on Owen Barfield, Simon said, yeah, the same happened to him. He just wouldn't talk about his life. You know, he would just talk about this one thing that happened in his early 20s. He was age 22, 23. And he just wouldn't move beyond that event of dancing and music. And we both got the impression that it's because if you don't understand the importance of music and dance, you're not ready for the next step. And I was never ready for the next step. You know, I'm still on this first level of music and dance. You have to understand music and dance before you can get to the next level of the Inkling philosophy. So that's how important grandfather put music and dance. And he said music was primary, even more so than poetry. And he was, of course, a musician, but poetry and being an author is how he saw himself. Now, I knew grandfather well because I was 28 years old when he passed away, and he was 99 years old when he passed away. I'd go and visit him regularly. From the age of about 14, I'd go by myself because, frankly, I just preferred going by myself than with my parents. And so they'd go one Sunday, and I'd go on the following Sunday. So maybe every month, 2 months, I'd go and visit, and we'd have lunch and then English tea time together, sort of English tea and a scone or a sandwich or something like that. Yeah. So it was very nice, very pleasant. But that was my norm. But I did know him well, and I was his executor when he passed away, but not for his literary works. He had 4 literary executors, and that was all handled by other people. Anyway, grandfather lived his life in 3 parts, almost exactly equal parts of 33 years, sort of a significant number there. The first part, he was the poet-author. The middle part, he was a lawyer. But that middle part, which people perceive he was sort of frustrated by, was actually an important part of being in the real world. He wasn't in an ivory tower. He was dealing with real-world people, issues, experiences. And of course, he was C.S. Lewis's lawyer, as well as a lawyer to many other people. But that was an important part of his life, as well as a family man and a sort of identity as a lawyer. And then that last part was probably his favorite part, when he was the professor teacher, and he was a visiting professor in North America. So in America and in Canada, he went for a period of about 20 years as a visiting professor, sometimes almost a year at a time. And he spoke on both coasts, the East Coast and the West Coast, and the middle part, and in Vancouver. So all over America. And that was the time when America, just in the early 60s, the New Age was just starting to kick off. And a lot of the things that he was teaching about evolution of consciousness and the new ideas were sort of being picked up there. So he's always much, much bigger in America. As the Inklings are, they're much bigger in America. But I like to sort of remind people that grandfather was the only Inkling who actually was in America and taught in America. And of course, during this period, he was responsible for C.S. Lewis's estate because he was C.S. Lewis's executor, along with his first friend, Cecil Harwood. So they had that role, and he was able to sort of push forward Inkling studies because he was in that role as executor, if you like. And it was a kind of a very open time, very easy permissions, books were being published, research was being done, societies were being formed for C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. So that was kind of he had a kind of an oversight of what then became a kind of the Inkling studies kind of movement, if you like. But he himself, because he was still alive, he wasn't part of the studies movement. He was kind of a little bit separated from it. But I think he was happy to do that because he was always happy to be associated with that study group, because he knew that sooner or later, those great friends of his, Lewis and Tolkien, would be in some way signposts to grandfather. And in this way, he's right. I mean, you're interested in Tolkien, but you wouldn't be inviting me to speak if it hadn't been because grandfather is also connected to Tolkien. So they are genuinely signposting to Tolkien. And I congratulated you at the start because, you know, this is new material. Grandfather knew that his work wouldn't be understood until about 2030, 2035, just because the evolution of consciousness works that way. You know, humanity wasn't yet ready. So these friends of his kind of understood what he was saying. They were doing what they could for their time and place. But I think there was an expectation or understanding that things would move on and should move on as well. Now, this is where I step in at any talk and I say, look, if there's any academics in the room or even just anybody that can read a book and then explain it, please step forward and identify yourselves, because, you know, there's so much work on Barfield studies and Barfieldian philosophy that needs to be done. I would much rather not be speaking to you today, but there's nobody else to speak to you. So please, you know, encourage new PhD candidates or anybody, because this is a really open field. There's books that haven't been published. There's masses of paper in the Bodleian Library, research papers. You know, there's just a lot of material. And the point is, it's important. It's important for humanity to understand what is kind of going on here. Now, what is grandfather's kind of evolution of consciousness then? You know, what is he saying? Well, very simply, he's trying to say that humanity at some stage in the distant past had a different relationship to the divine, and he called that original participation. Then there was a sort of descent from that divine state, from that sort of state of being at one with the divine. It descended in a kind of U shape, and at the bottom of the U shape, there was a turning point in time. That turning point was the incarnation of Christ. So our relationship, or humanity's relationship with the Christ, changed because the divine incarnated at a particular point in time. And then thereafter, we've been able to go up the other side of the U. Now, we're right at the very bottom of the U. You know, 2,000 years since that incarnation is almost nothing in terms of human history. But there is a pathway upwards, and we're going towards final participation. So I produced a diagram of a U shape, which you can sort of see there. That's on the website. There's a lot more details about it. I did that diagram because on one essay that grandfather wrote explaining this, and he wrote the essay in 1928. So this is quite early, 1928. He was already writing about this. He had diagrams, and so I felt that diagram just needs to be updated, and that's why I did that. But these diagrams you can see on the website. The other thing that grandfather is known for is being a staunch person against the kind of materialist paradigm that our kind of modern society holds true to. In those days, when he was writing, it was called positivism. Now, positivism is still a term, but we tend to use reductive materialism now for the same thing. But he was an anti-positivist. He was fighting positivism. And in this, he had a lot in common with his fellow Inklings. This is what the fellow Inklings had in common, that they were sort of against the kind of prevailing modern materialistic society as being all overwhelming. And Grandfather was saying that a lot of the problems that we face today is because we've gone down some really deep dead ends that we're now finding ourselves with difficulty trying to find a way out of. In fact, we can't find a way out of because they are dead ends. We need to back up and start again and know where we've gone wrong, retrace our steps. This is what Grandfather's saying. And he called all this, and Grandfather's a great one for having sort of terms to encapsulate big philosophical ideas. He called this the unresolved residue of positivism. URP, unresolved residue of positivism. Unresolved because we've now got our problems. So we've followed a positive track and now we're in deep trouble. So it's unresolved. The residue is the problems that positivism has given us. And then positivism is this materialistic way of life that we have, it's given us these problems. So Grandfather was the champion fighter against positivism. And he was the most vocal, the one who called it out the most active, which is why people think he's the hardest to sort of get along with. The others sort of agreed with him, but they didn't want to rock the boat too much. They had their jobs to consider. They were working in a university environment. They were already a little bit as outsiders. There's only so much that they could do to go against the establishment. But Grandfather, who had none of that hanging over him, was quite able to call that out. Right, at this stage, I'll just say a few words about Rudolf Steiner and Anthroposophy. Now, Anthroposophy is a sort of a kind of idea that Rudolf Steiner coined, and it means, if you break it down, Anthroposophy, divine wisdom. So it's about understanding the divine in man. So that's a sort of a literal translation. But Steiner himself preferred to describe Anthroposophy as the consciousness of one's human nature. Consciousness of one's human nature. So you tie in, that's how it ties in with Grandfather's. So Grandfather's theme was the evolution of consciousness. And he'd been studying that for quite a few years when he came across Steiner. And then he realized that Steiner was saying the same things that he had reached a conclusion about. But not only was Steiner saying it, he was saying it to a much deeper level, to a much higher level. And Steiner and Grandfather did meet because Steiner came to England on quite a lot of occasions. In fact, England was the country that he most visited and spoke at outside of Germany. He really felt there was something important in terms of the English language and the English consciousness, which I think he was right about, because this conference that you're giving in Spain, we are speaking English at. So, he foresaw this use of English. Steiner did. But the Inklings themselves were very, very concerned about this English consciousness and this Englishness and what it stands for. And they could also see it being eroded. So the Englishness that they're talking about, the English conscious mind, is different to what other people might just think about as England now. Anyway, I mentioned Steiner because at some point or other, if you're going to study Grandfather, you're going to have to encounter Anthroposophy and develop a kind of connection to that in some way. Grandfather was a founding father of the Great British Society of Anthroposophy. So he translated a lot of Steiner's text into Britain. So a lot of the kind of introduction of Steiner into the English-speaking world was done by Grandfather and through Grandfather. And also he explained a lot of it. And a lot of people found Steiner quite difficult to understand, and they preferred Grandfather's explanations of it. So people would go to Grandfather rather than Steiner. But Grandfather always deferred to Steiner, and he was on the committee of this society for over 45 years. He was a committee member. And the chairperson, Cecil Harwood, that name again, was Cecil Harwood, the chairperson. For that same length of time, an incredibly long time, these two friends were carrying that. Grandfather wrote the Articles of Association for the Society. I'm just sort of saying that these are things that are integral to his life. But there are people that know Anthroposophy, just normal people, not scholars or anything. They know anthroposophy. And then they see Tolkien and they see references to Tolkien and they see Tolkien on television or what have you. And they think, well, Tolkien must have known about anthroposophy because there's so much anthroposophy in Tolkien. How's that possible? But the connection's never made. And, well, the connection is through Barfield. It's because on those long walks and all the discussions they were having, grandfather was explaining these things, these big picture things, and Tolkien was sort of absorbing them and taking them on as you would do, because they're just interested, and in whatever way you take them on, he is taking them on. So there is a direct connection, I think, between grandfather explaining anthroposophy and Tolkien's work at some level, accepting it or working on it. Anyway, all that needs to be explored a lot more. And Tolkien died about 50 years ago. Grandfather died about 25 years ago. But the only book that I know that deals with that is this one was published 3 years ago. And it's Tolkien, Barfield, and the Cosmic Christ by an American independent scholar called Luigi Morelli. I mean, I'm not saying you have to get this book or anything. I'm just saying, in all the literature on all the Inklings, this is the only, one book is not very much. And a lot more could be said. This guy's working by himself in isolation. I'm going to allow time for a discussion because I like discussions. That's the way the Inklings move forward in terms of conversations. But before I do that, because this TV series, Rings of Power, is on the screen and I saw the first two, I just wanted to mention a couple of things about that. I saw a lot of parallels with sort of Barfieldian philosophy. I wrote a couple of pages of notes, but I'm not going to bore you with them. I'm just going to mention 4 items where I see sort of Barfield or Barfieldianism in those, the first 2 that I watched. The first thing is this name of Harfoot, which is kind of the precursor to the Hobbit. And it just struck me, the similarity between Harfoot and Harwood. I'm absolutely sure there's a connection, and that the Harfoot is based on Harwood. Because if you read Tolkien's description of what a Harfoot is, and you know who Cecil Harwood is, it just sounds like him. A short guy, close to the earth, very humble, it just sounds like this guy, and you can just tell it's an in-joke. Harwood, it just is. And Harwood was so integral to the whole thing. The next thing is this man that's falling from the sky. I mean, what is that, a man falling from the sky? And then he can kind of sort of twist nature, and he can sort of has this relationship to nature. Well, it's original participation. That is grandfather's original participation. We are divine beings that descended, and we had a relationship with original participation, which is quite like that. I don't know where those TV people got that from, but I mean, that's pretty good of them to have got that. The next thing is enchantment and nature spirits. Well, this is Inkling through and through. I mean, if you're reading Barfield, he doesn't talk too much about it directly because he was writing in a time and an audience that was struggling to understand nature spirits and elemental beings. But we have moved on. Now, if we start talking about elemental beings, there are more and more people sort of seeing it. That our relationship with nature and the spirituality within nature is changing from the 1920s, 1930s to where we are now. I mean, in the last 90 years, we have progressed a little bit. And the greatest sort of image or symbol of this is on the elves, on the soldier elves, the ones that are on the hill fort. They all have this image of the green man on their breastplate. Now, the green man is a very English nature image, and they've all got it there. So there's a direct connection to Englishness, English conscious soul elements, which I was referring to, nature spirit, and through that and on from that, elemental beings. And that's kind of the way elemental beings play out as well. Now, that is just Inkling, and it's just Barfield, and I'm so pleased that it came out quite well in that series, I thought. And then the final thing that I'm going to say is there's this kind of general movement. The elves moved from the west to Middle Earth, this kind of movement from the west. Well, that's kind of Rudolf Steiner. This is Rudolf Steiner's teaching. So Rudolf Steiner was talking about Atlantis, a movement from the West. He talks in terms of ages. I mean, Tolkien calls it Middle Earth, but Grandfather and Steiner have been talking about this place where we are now. They call it the post-Atlantean age. This idea of ages. We're now in the 5th post-Atlantean age. All that comes from Steiner. This way of understanding flows of consciousness, mystic flows, past ages, all that, that is just anthroposophy, which is why anthroposophy say that there must be something more to this. It just so stand out. And my last little observation on that series is that, as far as I can see, nobody has yet smoked a pipe. But that doesn't make sense, because Grandfather smoked a pipe all the time. He was never not smoking a pipe, only to eat and sleep. Other than that, he was constantly smoking a pipe. And I must say, I do miss his pipe smoke. Thank you.